I feel somewhat intimidated by introduction. And and I feel that it puts me under some pressure, because if I don't measure up, then I guess people would say that I didn't quite sing for dinner. But be that as it may, I can see General Jacob smiling, but be that as it may, we are today discussing a subject which cuts very close to our home. And this discussion has to transcend the geographical borders of South Asia, because both Islam and the radical variant of it are global phenomena. And what happens in South Asia will impact on what happens in the rest of the world and vice versa. We had a first glimpse of it when shortly after it was known that the Americans are going to withdraw from Afghanistan fully in 2014. You had an escalation of trouble in Africa. Many of us had foreseen that, and I had even written about it in my book, Endgame in Afghanistan, that this was bound to happen. Because they had a very elaborate plan. Syed Salim Shahzad was an outstanding Pakistani journalist who was killed by the ISI. And in his book on Al-Qaeda, he had written about the global strategy. And I'm mentioning this because South Asia has to be understood in terms of the global strategy. And according to this, an important focus had to be the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, because between themselves, between these two areas, controlled the main trade routes between East and the West, and the main oil routes to the West, and also to countries like India. So any power that has a hold on this region would be able to hold the world to blackmail. This was one clearly stated strategy. And therefore, and they believed that after American withdrawal from Afghanistan, time would come when they would concentrate on Africa and also Europe. Then there was a slight shift in the trend. Even before Europe, they thought they had to concentrate on Africa for two reasons. First, they believed that because of the drone attacks, eventually the killing of Osama bin Laden, Pakistan and that region of Afghanistan might become unsafe for Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda might even lose it. So we needed another base, another staging ground for attacks on the West and the rest of the world. So the focus on Africa. Similarly, as a corollary thereof, there was a focus on Bangladesh. There is a focus on Bangladesh. If you remember, immediately after 2001, when the Americans attacked Afghanistan, there was a flow of Islamist fundamentalists into Bangladesh. There were Al-Qaeda people running into Bangladesh to hide, and they were welcomed and lionized by Begum Khaleda Zia's cabinet and placed in various mosques and oils. So on the one see a certain linkage between finding different bases or alternative bases of operation. That is one part of it. First part is that they get a stranglehold of the world. Second part is they get various stages. They are diffusing the bases of their operations so that it becomes difficult for the West to concentrate their striking power in one area. This is strategic dispersion. Now, once that happens, what is the next step? For that, we need to understand a little more what is radical Islam. We know that radical Islam is more or less synonymous with political Islam. We know that radical Islam means that eventually Islam should dominate every aspect of human life, because Islam is not only just a religion but a political ideology as well. And I would recommend one book in this, Khalid bin Saim's Western Dominance and Radical and Political Islam, Challenge and Response, published with Oxford University Press, Karachi, 1995. It's a very interesting book which gives a clear account of the way of thinking that permeates protagonists of radical Islam. Now, once you admit that Islam as a religion must permeate every walk of life, must control every area of human activity and category of human action, you come to a question of what exactly do you mean in terms of operative principles. There are two aspects of it. One is ibadat. Ibadat is a method of worship. And the other is mamuliyat. Mamuliyat is interpersonal relationship. The problem does not rise in the area of ibadat. The problem arises in the area of mamuliyat. And in that area, what is, we enter a minefield. Because when you talk of interpersonal relationship, you talk of gender justice. When you talk of interpersonal relationship, you talk of your freedom to be entertained in any way of life. Your freedom to listen to music, to see movies, to paint, to take photographs, keep pictures in your house, celebrate marriages loudly, have festivals, have women walking in the streets, women part of the workforce, women in films, women singing, dancing. Now there Islamist fundamentalists see a red flag. I will not go into the details of it because the character of the order that prevailed in Afghanistan under Taliban rule is by now well established, well known. It just made women disappear. Half of the population ceased to exist. There's an organization called Physicians for Human Rights which operates out of Washington DC in the US. It had a survey in 1998 and prepared about the condition of Afghan women under Taliban rule. And I recommend that everybody who is interested should read it because it's a devastating comment on the kind of degeneration, degradation women had to suffer. Even basic medical attention was denied to them. It's unbelievable. We have heard of it, we have thought of it, we have read about it, but this was in one place brought together by a group of doctors who knew what they were talking about, and this was absolutely shuddering. When I read, I said, my God, which century are we living in? But let's not get carried away with that. The point is, here is what we have said, way of life. We have talked about mamuliyat. From mamuliyat to various issues concerned with it, including gender justice. And now, the question is radical Islam a monolithic entity or is it not? There are two main streams of this. One is conservative Islam, which is represented by an organization like Muslim Brotherhood, Jamia Ikhwan Muslimin. It is a conservative body, but not an extremist, militant, violent body. Established by Hassan al-Banna in 1928, it has been abjuring violence. Sanchitev is one of the persons known to have written on it, and I think it would be very instructive if we go and look at Ikhwan Web, which is the English website of the Muslim Brotherhood. And there is a treatise, very long treatise of the philosophy of Islamic Brotherhood, but Muslim Brotherhood. The central theme of it is thou shalt not get into violent activity. It has to be a gradualistic move to Islam through propagation, through propaganda, through education, through discussion, and through social work. Muslim Brotherhood has a whole host of hospitals, schools, colleges to its credit. Question is, where does it come into the picture of radical Islam? The picture is it believes in the supremacy of Islam in every area, but it leaves a lot of leeway. And one of the things is in the area of gender. Islam, Muslim Brotherhood's founders included 1,000 women. It has Sheikh Qaradawi, one of its ideological inspirations, has 3 daughters. Each of them a PhD, and one of them is a nuclear PhD in nuclear physics. So what we are looking at is a brand of Islam which is conservative, which would not want women to wear jeans, which did not want women to go around with their head uncovered, which would not want women to do certain things, which would also not allow a lot of kind of things we have in by way of entertainment. It will not allow a certain brand of politics, but it is different from Al-Qaeda. It's different from Taliban. Problem is, like all movements, Islamic Brotherhood has also various sectors into it. Liberal, reformist, hardliners. If it has liberal clerics like Al-Qaradawi, Sheikh Al-Qaradawi, it has also hardliners who sympathize with Al-Qaeda, who wanted to declare jihad when in January 2011 Egypt was in turmoil, and it wanted Islamist fundamentalists to capture power through violence. It was rebuffed by the leadership. But simply because it was rebuffed by leadership doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There are many reasons why it exists, and we'll go into that later on. But one thing that we must know, that if time comes, if the climate seems to shift, these elements may reassert themselves. And then what we'll see, that what we consider to be the conservative element, much more moderate than Al-Qaeda Taliban, will railroaded into following the same line. Today, Muslim Brotherhood has come to power in Egypt through elections, getting 47% of the seats in the polls held in January 2012. Its president, or the president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, who got elected in June 2012, is a highly educated person. Muslim Brotherhood is an organization of professionals, highly qualified, highly educated people who are not fundamentalists, but who are vulnerable to the pressures of fundamentalism, because once you accept a certain premise that this is final, there is no other way, then your ability to maneuver diminishes. And when the pressure comes, as we have seen happen, moderates get completely swept away and the tide of fanaticism prevails. So when we talk of radical Islam, we have to think of 2 things. Not only about fundamentalists, but about moderates. Not only about moderates, but the dangers that moderates face. And is it in our interest to keep the moderates alive? And is it possible for us to have a dialogue with them? And can we prevent an extremist takeover by holding dialogues with the moderates? This is one aspect of the issue. This is the theoretical, ideological aspect of the issue. Then the geopolitical aspect of the issue. Because theory doesn't exist in a vacuum. When we come to the geopolitical aspect, the predominant strand in that has to be the strategic aspect. And the strategic aspect would be the implications of the emergence of radical Islam in South Asia. Here also we see 2 strands. There is a conservative strand. There is a militant strand. The militant strand is represented by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, as elsewhere. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are reasonably well entrenched in Pakistan, particularly the Taliban. Both Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and Afghan Taliban. And today, it is not, one does not know whether they will be able to take over Pakistan or not. There is a possibility that they will. It's also a possibility that even if they do not take over the government of Pakistan, they can be in a position they can use Pakistan territory as they have been using, as launching pad for terrorist strikes against other countries, and the Pakistani government either will not be able to do anything or will not do it. They have been doing that. 9/11 was staged from Pakistan. 26/11 was staged from Pakistan. Part connivance, part helplessness. But the sum total is that it is an exporter of terrorism. This is one aspect of it. Second, this is happening when you have an organized government in Pakistan which is under some compulsion to maintain a semblance of activity in terms of containing terrorism. After all, immediately after 9/11, when the ultimatum was held out to Pakistan, behave or else, it had to fall in line. And it had to go through the motions of doing something to contain terrorism, though its heart was not in there very clearly, or even if its heart was there, it was not able to contain it. So whatever the reason, we had a certain level of export of terrorism in Pakistan, from Pakistan. What happens if the government crumbles? Which can? Today Nawaz Sharif has gotten near the absolute majority, but not an absolute majority. One doesn't know, he wants friendship with India, one doesn't know what the ISI will do, what the Pakistani army will do, what General Kayani will do. So there are so many imponderables in the situation in Pakistan, when no one can really predict what happens. And all predictions tend to be on the gloomier side. Because one cannot see a Pakistani state which will be efficient enough to deal with terrorism, B, have the will to do so. Because there are so many private arrangements. Nawaz Sharif is very close to Hafiz Muhammad Saeed, who is the boss of AIT. His brother Shahbaz Sharif has close ties with Lashkar-e-Jhangi. So, will they be able to act against this? If they take action, will they not go the way of Benazir Bhutto, Salman Taseer? To what extent could you dare to stand up to assassinations, murders? Because after all, assassination is a weapon of terrorization which can be very effective in a country like Pakistan. So these are some of the questions. Radical Islam, the battle between conservatives and militants there, developments in the South Asia, how do these developments impinge on the war between militants and conservatives? It is not. At one level, it's very easy to say. If it seems that the conservatives are having their way, if it seems that the Al-Qaeda and Taliban are having their way, if it seems that the government of Pakistan will totter, then the stock of the extremists will rise. And to that extent, the hysteria will see a withering of the stock of the moderates. And that will happen particularly, even if Pakistan doesn't fall, if the Taliban makes substantial gains in Afghanistan. Hence the importance of the year 2014. It remains to be seen the extent to which the Americans will drop. It remains to be seen what they leave behind. We have been hearing of various force strengths that they might leave behind. 15,000, 20,000. We have been hearing the purpose of these troops who would be there, training, intelligence-directed operations like the one that eliminated Bin Laden. We have been hearing of a lot of functions about a lot of things that the American troops will do and the size of the troops, but no clear picture has yet emerged. But one thing is certain, as it stands today, the Afghan National Security Forces will not be able to stand up to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda who would be backed by Pakistan. It is not that they lack in bravery, no. They do not lack in bravery. They lack in weaponry. Do you know they don't even have artillery of their own? Artillery support is provided by Americans and the European British troops and German troops. They have no air force, not even one fighter bomber, not even one combat aircraft. Transport, yes. Helicopters, yes. Battle helicopters, yes. But you cannot win a war against Taliban and Al-Qaeda only with the help of helicopter battleships. They don't even have sophisticated communication equipment. When they go into action, communication is done by ISAF troops, International Security Assistance Force troops. So it is a body of people who are committed, but who are totally under-equipped to fight. Most of the equipment promised to them have not come. And not only are they under-equipped, under-trained, and they're under-strength. Given the compulsions and the challenges of counterinsurgency, for a country of the size of Afghanistan, you would need at least 500 to 750,000 troops. Initially, the Afghan National Security Forces, which includes the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police Forces, were to be of the strength of 352,000. But now, because of financial cuts, they may be much, much less. We have been hearing about figures which may not be even 2 lakhs. If that is so, then underarmed, without transportation, without artillery, air force support, and completely inadequate in numbers, even the bravest troops in the world will not be able to hold their own. So if that happens, if the Americans really leave lock, stock and barrel, you have a situation where it's a matter of time before the Taliban and Al-Qaeda take over. It may not be that simple, because in 1989, after the Soviets withdrew, everybody had said that the government would last not much. Yet it lasted, the Afghan government lasted for 3 years, 1992. And then again it lasted till 1996 before Najibullah was dragged out from this hideout and murdered. So Najibullah had not only held out till 1992, but inflicted some very substantial reverses on Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces. They are not Taliban, they are Taliban but not Al-Qaeda forces. Taliban in the making. He lost it only when the Soviets stopped helping with money and weapons. So we are about to see, possibly, a repeat of 1992. Hamid Karzai, Afghanistan, prepared to fight, but lacking in weapons, supplies, abandoned in midstream and losing out. In that is the scenario of what we have said, an extremist surge sweeping radical Islam, taking over both, carrying the moderates in their stride, will be a phenomenon. And this one can see emerging around 2016. 2016, we need to look at the strategic scenario here. 2014 elections in India, May. 2013 end or 2014 beginning, elections in Bangladesh. Sheikh Hasina is pro-India. Sheikh Hasina has done for India which no other Prime Minister of Bangladesh has done. Sheikh Hasina has done for India what no other friendly country has done, handed over all our insurgents to us. He is prepared even to give us transit, has clamped down on anti-India fundamentalists. Let's have no illusion. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party is pathologically anti-India. Anyone who remembers what happened on 7th of September 2004 will recognize that. there was a conference of young journalists in Dhaka. Morshid Khan was then the foreign minister of Bangladesh. And here and there, in the presence of the Indian High Commissioner, in the presence of the diplomatic corps, he holds out a threat. And what was the threat? If Bangladesh is surrounded by India, Northeast India is surrounded by Bangladesh. By one stroke of my pen, I can cut off the 3 billion export India has in Bangladesh. Not only that, he went further and said the Reserve Bank of India was discriminating against Northeast India, and was not allowing even letters of credit to be opened abroad by Northeast Indian states without its permission. There was a clear attempt to foment trouble. And not only that, it was also the period in which Bangladesh was the happy hunting ground of every insurgent group operating in Northeast India. They are provided with refuge, they are provided with money, they are provided with weapons. It was just the recovery on April 2, 2002 in Chittagong of 11 truckloads of arms that were coming for India, which showed the extent of the support that was coming in. This is only one recovery. The kind of money, the kind of support, the kind of training facilities that were extended to them were completely smashed by Sheikh Hasina, and most of them were handed over to us. But suppose in 2014 January, Sheikh Hasina is defeated. Who will come to power? The coming of the BNP and the Jamaat alliance, or the 18-party alliance, of which they are the two spearheads. And what is Jamaat's view of India? There is a policy in Jamaat's website. It was quoted I quoted it in my Bangladesh book. And there Abbas Ali Khan, a senior leader, says that Bangladesh can be threatened by only one country, India. And if Bangladesh is threatened by India, then the only way we can fight is the spirit of jihad. So from the beginning, our troops should be steeped into the culture of jihad against a specific target, India. So Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, in its website, by Abbas Ali Khan, or then its Amir, and who is upstairs now, had clearly identified India as an enemy and wanted a spirit of jihad to permeate the Bangladeshi army so that India can be kept at bay. And not only that, Bangladesh at that time, with the help of the Jamaat, had become a major terrorist center. Jagrata Muslim Janata Bangladesh, the kind of reign of terror it had established in northwestern part of the country. And then Jamatul Mujahid in Bangladesh, Harkatul Jihad al-Islami Bangladesh. Now all these organizations, HJI was set up in 1992 in Bangladesh by people who had returned from Afghan Jihad, and present there was the secretary of Osama bin Laden, who had brought in a certain donation. It was a direct creation of Al-Qaeda. So we have this terrorist organization, we had them very active, terribly anti-India, and they are just waiting for Sheikh Hasina to go. Who else is waiting? Very recently there was a huge gathering in Dhaka by Hifazat-e-Islam, about 500 to 600,000 people. And the whole idea was to bring down Hasina's government by force. It was scuttled. Hasina acted tough. The kind of steel she displayed has not been displayed by any of any leader of the subcontinent in recent times. She just decided to scatter it and did it. Now, that does not mean that Hifazat-e-Islam, which is an organization of madrasas in Chittagong, Khatasai part of Chittagong, has disappeared. And even more important, was a 13-point demand raised by Hifazat Islam. That was scripted by the Taliban. Absolutely scripted by the Taliban. If you see the demands and if you see the kind of order that prevailed in Afghanistan under the Taliban, you see the orders issued in September 1996 by the Taliban about what should be done and what should not be done by women, by people, whether you should cut your hair, whether you should cut your beard, whether you should have a photograph in your house, whether scooter rickshaws would take women who have not covered their heads, and if women have covered their heads, what extent the covering should be. Now you see a absolute parallel of that in the 13th Fire program by Hifazat Islam. Then let's go back even a little further. August 31, 1941, in the city of Lahore, an organization was set up by a man called Abu Ala Maududi, Jamaat-e-Islam. If you see the manifesto of Jamaat-e-Islam, you would find it's almost a replica of the kind of order that Taliban established in Afghanistan, and what the Hifazat and their friends want to establish in Bangladesh. There is therefore a linear progression and a clearly traceable path in the evolution of ideological thought from Maududi and to Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and an essentially radical pan-Islamic view. It is not an Islamic view. Islam is not a religion that's fundamentalist. I think there is no time for me to go into that here, but I would recommend 3 books. First of all, Historical Role of Islam by Emil Roy. It's a very, very important book. Second, Deen-e-Ilahi, The Religion of Akbar, by Professor Emil Roy Choudhury of Calcutta University. It was published in 1952, but remains an absolute classic. It shows how a dynamic, vibrant religion, which at that point, when it was first created, was at the forefront of intellectual activity, was completely given a new twist with the fall of Umayyads and Abbasid Caliphs. How it was hijacked by the Mongols, how it was hijacked by then before that by the Turks, and the whole thing was given an entirely different start. In fact, when we talk of Salafist Islam, it's a joke. Because if you see at the time of the Prophet, women were allowed to come out even go to mosque on their own. Prophet's own wife was there on the battlefield in the Battle of Uhud. Aisha, tending to the wounded. Women were allowed to take part in public life. The Quran prescribed women in share of property when no other religious document in the West provided. The libraries of Islamic cities had the kind of book collection which even the library at Canterbury did not have. Progress of science. And there is all this, another very important book, Islam and Modernity, by Maulana Wahiduddin Khan. Now, there was this radical Islam. There is a great parallel. Early Marx, the liberal early Marx, the doctrinaire later Marx. Some people have said early Gandhi, later Gandhi. But there is a tendency of all schools of thought to atrophy and be taken over. So there was a time, and that tradition still exists. But what has happened is this, that aspect of Islam has been completely, the progressive, modernizing aspect of Islam, the liberating aspect of Islam has been completely obscured by the commotion created by Taliban, Al-Qaeda, which is completely railroading today all debate within Muslims. Here again is something which is strategically significant. Should we not, if once we take Islam as something monolithic, it becomes Islam versus the rest. Is it fair? It is not fair. Second, once you do that, the other problem that you face is that of taking on the entire Islam. Both tactically and morally it is important not only to differentiate between moderate and radical Islam, but make sure that radical Islam does not have its way. Because once it has its way, the entire clock of progress by civilization will go back, will be far beyond even Middle Ages. That is one part of it. Second part of it is that we have described the strategic scenario in 2016. 2014, suppose Sheikh Hasina is defeated. 2016, suppose Taliban take over Afghanistan. We have not talked about one country in between, India. What is going to happen to us in 2016? Do we have a stable government? Do we have a government that knows its business? Does it know how to deal with extremism of various sorts? As I speak, 2 days before what happened, with the entire cream of Congress leadership in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh was wiped out. Why? Nationalists. 1 year earlier, 74 members of the CRPF were wiped out exactly in the same place. We have learned nothing. Like the Bourbons of France, we have forgotten nothing and learned nothing. Second, it's not just internal. What is does anybody know our strategy regarding Pakistan? We have no strategy, except making placatory sounds. Whenever something happens, we go like a lion. Then after a while, we say, no, let's be accommodating, friendship first. You cannot change your neighbor. You can change your policy, but you cannot change your neighbor. So Pakistan will be there. We have to find a modus vivendi. What is the modus vivendi? Well, we'll resume talking if you take action against the perpetrators of 26/11. Of course, no. Then the next step is we see, terribly sorry, I know you're finding it difficult to take action against the perpetrators of 26/11. We are good neighbors. We won't try to embarrass you. So just forget it. Let's get ahead. Then came some other slap. No. We have to be. We want one surrender to another surrender. I for never would say that we have a confrontationist, belligerent line towards Pakistan. But we must know, we must have a strategy. What is it that we are aiming? Can we believe that we can have a dialogue with the civilian government of Pakistan when the military calls the shots? You remember Shuja Pasha, the chief of ISI, wanted to come to India immediately after 26/11. Then he was overruled by the army. Even the Prime Minister of Pakistan said that he is coming. Never came. So as long as we have a Pakistani military establishment, which is pathologically anti-India, whose strategic doctrine and involves, and it is its strategic doctrine, balkanization of India. Because that, they say, is the only way of cutting India down to size. Again, it's a quote from the strategic doctrine. Now, if that is so, who do we talk to? Do we talk to the Pakistani military? Have we able to talk to Pakistani military? Now, what will we do in 2016 if immediately after the Al-Qaeda Taliban call the shots in Pakistan, they decide to step up the terrorist strikes against us? And mind you, they will do it. Salim Shahzad, I have to go back to him again. In his book, he says that there is a saying of the Prophet that the end of time battles, which will lead to the re-establishment of the Caliphate and the triumph of Islam worldwide, would begin in the East. The East in those days was a place called Khorasan. Khorasan is what? Today is Afghanistan, part of Iran, part of Syria, and part of Central Asia. After victory in the Battle of Khorasan, the victorious Islamic army will go in for Ghazwa-e-Hind. After Ghazwa-e-Hind, they will turn westward and defeat the West finally in area around Palestine. And according to Salim Shahzad, murdered by the ISI brutally, the Ghazwa-e-Hind has already begun. It began as early as 1980s, when Pakistan began to train Sikh militants in camps meant for Afghan jihadis. So, if that is so, there will be a significant stepping up of 2611 type of strikes against us. If so, what do we do? Do we go for a conventional war? Will a conventional war remain at the level of a conventional war? Will there be a nuclear dimension to it? I don't think we will go. We have the stomach for a conventional war. In any case, I strongly believe that days of conventional wars are over. And the days of nuclear war may, I'll come to that later on, but increasingly the wars of the future would be unconventional wars in which the kind of attacks which led to the elimination of Bin Laden will become the principal form of strike. There will be drone attacks, there will be intelligence-driven raids, there will be sabotage of social cohesion, there will be a whole host of things. Cyber attacks, undermining of social cohesion, promotion of communal tension, promotion of social differences. Now, these are going to be used to undermine the unity and cohesion of countries. And for that, an entirely different course of information, disinformation will have to be decided upon, including the kind of deployment of troops. What kind of troops? What kind of troops do you need to create communal tension in neighboring country? What kind of troops do you need to see that the economic differences in neighboring country becomes more acute? So you have to think completely in different lines. We have been thinking. Today, for example, if we have a war with Pakistan, and Pakistan says that 1 mile more into Pakistani territory, we will unleash our nuclear missiles. What will be our response? We should be in a position to throw a cyber attack to completely paralyze Pakistan's nuclear command system. Will be able to do that? Are we thinking along those lines? No. Whole host of different strategic thinking is needed. We are just not thinking along those lines. We have to take our thinking into an entirely new level. How to promote discord in another country. How to prevent another country from promoting discord in your territory. How to demolish the command control system of another country's military. How to protect your own. Wars of the future will be fought increasingly in the mind. Increasingly in the mind. And we have to think in terms of those. We have not been thinking. Secondly, we must also realize war is not a nice thing. It's one thing that war is not a nice thing. While we should be absolutely prepared to foil machinations of other states, we must, in our own conduct, be as just, as fair as possible to our neighbors. We may not love our neighbors as ourselves, but certainly we have no business not to give Tista waters to Bangladesh. We have no business not to carry the Enclaves Exchange Pact which we have signed with Bangladesh. We are reneging on our promise. Similarly, if Pakistan, we have clear signs that there is a change in Pakistan's attitude. we'll have to accommodate Pakistan. But before that, we have been bitten so many times. We have to be very, very sure that there is a change. There is a change, because there lies the catch. We believe there is a change. Zardari smiled at us. Sharif smiles at us. Can he say sorry, Trump? No. Go ahead. Go and listen. Now this is not something that will happen. So here we are. There is a menace of Islamic fundamentalism, which is not Islam. Let us understand it is not Islam. It's a parody of Islam. It's a travesty of Islam. I've studied Islam at some length, and I know it's a very different religion from what some of its champions have studied today. Second, we must not only think of dealing with that Islam, letting Islam get back on its own rails by its own effort. Second, we have to make sure that our borders are safe, our societies are safe. And for that, we have to think in strategic and tactical lines which we have not done before. Diplomacy is important, absolutely. But talk softly and carry a big stick. That was what Theodore Roosevelt, who was called the Rough Rider President of the United States, said. And I think there is a lot of sense in it. Do not brag, do not boast, do not bluster. Keep a low profile, but let people know that India is a country you don't trifle with. Because if you trifle with, there'll be hell to pay for. Thank you.